The morning I walked back into that Truist Bank branch on North Tryon Street, I wasn't angry. That part surprised even me. 90 days had passed since the young man behind the counter had laughed. A real laugh. Not a polite smile, not a suppressed chuckle. A full, dismissive, chest-shaking laugh at my gray wool suit. And in those 90 days, I had done what I'd always done when someone underestimated me. I got quiet. I got methodical. And I let the truth do what the truth always does. It came out on its own. The branch manager, a man named Derek Caldwell, who had only been in that position for 4 months, came through the glass doors of his office the moment he saw me walk in. He didn't walk toward me. He moved. There's a difference. He came across that marble floor with his hand already extended, his head already tilted forward in that particular way that isn't quite a bow, but is close enough to make the people watching feel it. And they were watching. The tellers. The customers waiting in line. The security guard near the door who recognized me and nodded. And Marcus, the young man who had laughed, was standing at his station, third window from the left, frozen. I looked at Marcus only once. Just long enough for him to understand that I remembered. Then I shook Derek Caldwell's hand and followed him into his office. That moment, that walk across the lobby, is where this story ends. But to understand it, you need to go back to where it began. Before I do that, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from right now and what time it is where you are. If you believe that dignity is not something you earn from other people, it's something you carry, hit that like button and subscribe. This channel is for people who understand that. Now, let me take you back 90 days. My name is Theodore James Washington. I'm 67 years old. I was born in the West End of Charlotte, North Carolina, in a house on Tuckasegee Road that my grandfather built with his own hands in 1951. I raised my children in Eastover, in a 4-bedroom brick home on Wendover Road that I paid for in cash in 1998. I've been married to the same woman, Claudette Irene Washington, knee porter, for 41 years. I graduated from Johnson C. Smith University in 1980 with a degree in business administration. I am a life member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, Incorporated. I built a commercial real estate portfolio in Charlotte and the surrounding Mecklenburg County that, as of last March, was valued at just over $4,200,000. I'm telling you all of this not to impress you. I'm telling you because what happened on that Thursday morning in October needed context. Because without context, it's just a rude young man being rude to an old man. And that's not what it was. The suit I was wearing that morning was a charcoal gray wool blend. I bought it in 1994 from a tailor on East Trade Street named Mr. Albert Simmons, who has since passed on. It was custom made. It fit me then, and, God willing, it still fits me today because I've kept myself at roughly the same weight for 30 years. I wore that suit to my son Darius's college graduation at UNCC. I wore it to the closing on my first commercial property on South Boulevard. I wore it to my mother's funeral in 2011. It wasn't a suit I wore every day. It was a suit I wore on days that mattered. That Thursday in October was not a ceremony. It was a routine banking transaction. I needed to execute a wire transfer from my business account, a sum of $847,000. That was the second installment on a mixed-use development project I was closing in Belmont, just west of Charlotte. I had done wire transfers from that branch before. I had banked with that institution, under its various names and mergers, for over 30 years. I simply hadn't been inside that particular branch in several months because I'd been conducting most of my transactions through my private banker, a woman named Patricia Howell, who was on medical leave. So I put on my gray wool suit, not because I was going to the bank. I put it on because I had a lunch afterward at Aria on East 5th Street with 2 of my former fraternity brothers from JCSU, and I hadn't seen them in 6 months. and some occasions call for a particular kind of respect. I drove my 2009 Buick LeSabre, not the Cadillac, not the Mercedes. The Buick, because it was a Tuesday, and Claudette had the Cadillac at her sister's house in Huntersville. I parked on the street. I walked in. The branch on North Tryon Street, the Truist Center branch at 214 North Tryon, has high ceilings and marble floors and the kind of hush that banks use to make money feel serious. There were 4 telewindows open. 3 had lines. 1 was empty. The young man behind the empty window was in his mid-20s, with a thin mustache and a name tag that read Marcus. He saw me approaching, and I watched the calculation happen on his face. It's a look I've seen my entire life. It's the look that comes before the decision, before someone decides who you are based on everything except who you actually are. I told him I needed to initiate a wire transfer. He asked for my account number. I gave it from memory. I've always had a mind for numbers, and he looked at his screen, and something shifted. Not enough to correct the course he was already on, but enough that I noticed it. Later, I would think about that shift, about what he saw on that screen and chose to ignore. Do you have your ID? He asked. I handed him my driver's license. He looked at it. Then, he looked at the amount I'd written on the transfer form. $847,000. And he smiled. Not at me. It was the kind of smile people give when they think something is a mistake, when they think you've confused yourself. Sir, this is a pretty significant transfer, he said. Are you sure you have this kind of funds available? I told him I was certain. He typed something, waited, typed something else. Then he turned to a colleague at the next window, a young woman who appeared to be about the same age, and he said something I was not meant to hear clearly, but did. He said, and I quote, "Got a guy over here trying to wire almost $1 million. And he laughed. He actually laughed. Short, low, disbelieving. She didn't laugh with him, to her credit. She glanced at me with an expression I recognized as embarrassment, not for herself, but for him. Marcus composed himself and turned back to me. I'm going to need to have a supervisor approve this, he said. That was standard procedure for a transaction of that size. I understood that. What was not standard was the tone. The way he said supervisor carried something extra in it. Something that meant someone is going to come over here and confirm what I already think, which is that you don't belong in this transaction. I said calmly, "That's fine. I'd like to see the manager, please." Marcus blinked. I don't think that was the response he expected. People who are embarrassed by the question usually get flustered or defensive. People who are confused sometimes get louder. I got very quiet and very specific, and I asked for the manager. He picked up his phone. He spoke quietly into it. And then he told me the manager would be right out and asked me to wait in the seating area near the door. I sat down in one of the chairs by the window. Outside, North Tryon Street moved the way it always does on a weekday morning. Delivery trucks, office workers, the light rail humming past on its tracks. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at the traffic. I thought about my mother, who used to say that the worst thing you can do to an arrogant person is remain calm. She called it the long game. She said, "Theodore, patience is the only weapon that doesn't run out of ammunition." I sat there for 11 minutes. The man who eventually came out to meet me was not the branch manager I had dealt with before. That had been a woman named Sandra Briggs, who retired in August. This new manager introduced himself as Garrison Webb. He was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with a firm handshake and the kind of cautious professionalism that told me he had been briefed on the transaction, but not on the account. He asked me to follow him to a desk near the back of the branch, away from the teller windows. He looked at the transfer form. He looked at his computer. He looked at the transfer form again. "Mr. Washington," he said, "I want to make sure I understand your request. This transfer is going to a Belmont Properties LLC, account ending in 4492. That's correct, I said. And the source funds, just so I can confirm. These are from your personal business account? From Washington Commercial Holdings, I said. The account number is on the form. He typed. And here is what I want you to understand about what happened in that moment. Garrison Webb was not a bad man. I don't believe that to this day. He was a new manager in a branch that was still figuring out who he was, and he had been handed a situation by a junior employee who had already colored the picture a particular shade before Webb ever sat down at that desk. He had been handed a narrative, and the narrative was, old black man, worn suit, claims to have nearly $1 million. Webb asked me for a second form of identification. I gave him my business card from Washington Commercial Holdings, which carries the address of my Eastover office and my attorney's contact information. I also gave him, as I always carry when conducting large transactions, a one-page asset summary that my accountant prepares quarterly. It showed total portfolio value, total liquid assets, and current outstanding obligations. It was a document that took about 45 seconds to read if you were paying attention. He read it. He read it again. The color changed in his face. It's subtle. I've seen it before, and I'll see it again. That particular recalibration that happens when someone realizes the frame they were given was wrong, and the picture they were looking at was always something entirely different. He cleared his throat. He said, "Mr. Washington, I apologize for the wait." He processed the transfer. He printed the confirmation. He walked me to the door himself, which was, I noticed, something he did not do for the customer who left just before me. I drove to Aria on East 5th Street. I had lunch with my fraternity brothers, Charles Everett Booker and Raymond Lloyd Simmons. The food was excellent. The company was better. I told them what had happened, and Charles, who is a retired federal judge and has heard more injustice in his life than most people ever will, put down his fork and looked at me. "Theo, what are you going to do about it?" I said, "Nothing yet. Nothing yet," he repeated. He picked his fork back up. He knew what that meant. He'd known me since 1977. Now, before we get into what came next, I need to ask you something. How many of you have ever walked into a room fully prepared, fully qualified, and still been made to feel like you needed to prove something that nobody else in that room ever had to prove? Leave that in the comments. Because what I'm about to tell you is not just my story. And if this has ever happened to you, you deserve to see how this ends. I don't live a flashy life. Claudette and I have never needed to. Our children, Darius, who is a cardiovascular surgeon at Atrium Health, and our daughter Renee, who teaches political science at UNC Charlotte, grew up understanding that wealth is not a performance. It's a responsibility. We don't discuss money loudly. We don't display it. We drive sensible cars. We wear clothes we love. We give to our church, Greater Bible Way Temple on Beatties, Ford Road, and to the scholarship fund we established at JCSU in my parents' names in 2006. That is our life. But that afternoon, sitting at the desk in my study with the transfer confirmation in my hand, I opened my laptop and I did two things. I pulled up the Truist customer feedback portal, and I pulled up the contact information for the Regional Vice President of Commercial Banking for the Carolinas, a man I have met twice at industry events, whose name was Vincent P. Hargrove. I had his card in the leather organizer on my desk because I keep every card from every professional interaction I've had since 1985. There are over 4,000 cards in that organizer. I didn't call Vincent Hargrove that night. What I did was right. I wrote down the sequence of events from that morning in precise chronological order. The time I arrived, 9:47 a.m. The teller's name, Marcus. The specific language used, the laughter. The reference to a supervisor delivered in a tone that carried something extra. The 11 minutes I sat waiting. The manager's name, Garrison Webb. The request for a second form of ID that, in 30 years of banking, I had never been asked for on a transaction in a branch where I held accounts. I wrote it all down with the same care I had used to document every property deal, every lease negotiation, every contract dispute in my career. Because in my experience, 67 years of experience, the difference between a complaint and a case is documentation. I set the legal pad on my desk. I poured 2 fingers of Woodford Reserve. I sat in the armchair by the window that looks out over the back garden, where the Japanese maple claudette planted in 1999 had just turned completely red for the fall. I thought about Marcus laughing behind his window. I thought about the colleague who hadn't laughed with him. I thought about Garrison Webb reading that asset summary and going very, very quiet. I was not angry. That might be the hardest thing to explain to someone who hasn't lived a life like mine. The anger burns off fast when you've encountered this enough times. What remains after the anger is something colder and more useful. What remains is clarity. The first call I made was not to Vincent Hargrove. The first call I made was to Patricia Howell. Patricia had been my private banker at that institution for 11 years. And while she was technically on medical leave, she had told me months earlier that she was reachable by cell phone for her long-standing clients if something important came up. Patricia answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Theodore, I want you to know that this is not how that branch operates under normal circumstances." She paused again. "And I want you to know that I'm going to make some calls tomorrow morning." I told her I appreciated it, but I asked her to hold off for a few days, that I had something in mind. There was a pause. "How long have I known you?" she said. 11 years, I said. "Then I know what something in mind means with you." She laughed softly. "All right, I'll hold. But Theodore, don't let it go too long. That branch needs to know before more damage is done." I thanked her and hung up. The next morning, I drove to my attorney's office. Lawrence Edward Pitton III. Larry has been my legal counsel since 1991. His firm is on South Tryon Street, 4 blocks from the Truist branch. I laid out what had happened, and I laid out what I intended to do. Larry leaned back in his chair and looked at me over his reading glasses. "You know you have a complaint here," he said. "A real one." "I know," I said. "The question is what you want the outcome to be." And that is the question. That is always the question. Not what do you want to say. Not how do you want to feel in the moment. What is the outcome you are actually building toward? I told Larry what I wanted. He wrote it down. He said, "Give me 2 weeks." I said, "You've got 4. He looked up at me. "Why 4? "Because I want Webb to get comfortable," I said. "I want him to think it passed. I want Marcus to think it was just another morning." Larry wrote something else down. He tapped the pad with his pen. "You know," he said, "I've been your lawyer for 33 years and you still occasionally surprise me." I told him I took that as a compliment. I drove home on Independence Boulevard, past the neighborhood where I grew up, past the church where my parents were married in 1954, past the elementary school that was torn down in 1989 to build a parking deck. I drove past all of it slowly. I thought about the version of this city that my grandfather had navigated, and my father after him, and me after him. The particular mathematics of being a black man of means in America, the constant recalculation required, the tax levied not on your income, but on your visibility, your dignity, your very right to be taken seriously in a room. I wasn't doing this for me. I want to be honest about that. I was past the age of doing things for my own ego. I was doing it because somewhere in that branch, there was probably a man or a woman with a smaller account balance and fewer attorneys on speed dial who, had been made to feel exactly the way Marcus had tried to make me feel, who had walked back to their car, diminished in a way that no banking transaction should ever make any human being feel. And I wanted what happened in the next few weeks to send a message that traveled further than me. Claudette was in the kitchen when I got home. She was making red beans and rice, a recipe that came from her grandmother in New Orleans, and the whole house smelled like Sunday. She looked at me when I walked in, and she knew immediately that something was in motion. "What did Larry say?" she asked. "He said 2 weeks," I said. "I gave him 4. She stirred the pot. She didn't look up. "So it's the long game. It's always the long game," I said. She nodded. She tasted the rice. She handed me the spoon to taste too. And then she said, the way only Claudette can say things, "Just make sure, at the end of it, you can still look at yourself the way your mother would want you to." I took that with me. I carried it through every step of what came next. Over the following 2 weeks, Larry had 3 conversations that I was not a party to. I know the broad outlines of what was said because he reported back to me after each one. The first conversation was with the office of the North Carolina Office of the Commissioner of Banks, where he filed a formal inquiry, not a complaint yet, an inquiry regarding discriminatory treatment in financial services under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. The second conversation was with a colleague of his who specialized in banking regulation and had handled 4 similar cases in the previous 3 years, 2 of which had resulted in significant institutional policy changes, and 1 of which had resulted in a settlement that Larry was not at liberty to discuss in detail, but described as considerable. The third conversation was with Vincent P. Hargrove. I didn't know about the third conversation until Larry called me on a Wednesday evening and said, "Theo, Vincent Hargrove would like to meet with you." I was quiet for a moment. "He called you?" I said. "He called me," Larry said. He had apparently been meaning to reach out since a colleague of yours mentioned the situation to someone who mentioned it to Hargrove's office. He paused. "Patricia Howell sends her regards." I almost smiled. Patricia Howell, on medical leave, had made her calls anyway. "When does he want to meet?" I asked. "He's available whenever you are," Larry said. Those were his words. "Whenever you are." I thought about that for a moment. Whenever you are. 3 weeks earlier, I had sat in a chair by the door of that branch for 11 minutes. Now the regional vice president of commercial banking for the Carolinas was available whenever I was. "Tell him Thursday," I said. "The branch on North Tryon Street. 9:30 in the morning." There was a pause on Larry's end. "You want to go back to the branch?" "I want to go back to the branch," I said. Another pause. "I'll let him know." I hung up. I went back to the armchair by the window. The Japanese maple had lost most of its red leaves by then, and the branches were bare and precise against the gray November sky. I sat there for a long time, thinking about Thursday, about the marble floor, about the third window from the left, about the fact that patience, in the end, had never once let me down. Aquí está Part 2. A rotero completo con desfecho. The Thursday morning of the meeting, I woke up at 5:30. That's not unusual for me. I've been waking up at 5:30 since my 40s, when I had construction crews starting at 6 and property inspections to walk before the business day began. Claudette was still asleep. I made coffee in the kitchen. Community coffee, dark roast, the way her grandmother used to make it in New Orleans. And I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, and I went over the sequence in my mind. Not because I was nervous. I want to be clear about that. I was 67 years old. I had walked into boardrooms, courtrooms, and bank offices my entire professional life. I had sat across tables from people who underestimated me, and I had let the work speak for itself every single time. What I was doing at that kitchen table at 5:30 in the morning was the same thing I had done before every significant meeting since 1982. I was getting still, getting centered, reminding myself what the purpose was and what the purpose was not. The purpose was not to embarrass Garrison Webb. It was not to have Marcus fired, though I had opinions about that which I would express when asked. The purpose was to walk back into that branch and conduct myself with such complete calm and authority that no one in that room, no one watching, no one behind the teller windows could ever again make the mistake that had been made on that October morning. The purpose was to make the correction permanent. I dressed carefully. I chose the dark navy suit, the Brooks Brothers, purchased in 2019, fitted by a tailor on Providence Road, a white shirt, a gold tie. The pocket square Claudette had given me for our 40th anniversary, pale blue silk, folded in a straight presidential fold, my alpha pin on the lapel. The shoes, black cap toes, polished the night before. I looked at myself in the mirror. I thought about my grandfather, who had built houses with his hands and been refused service in restaurants in the city where he was born. I thought about my father, who had driven past the same banks that had refused him loans to build a business from nothing, and who had died owning 3 properties and no debt. I thought about everything I was wearing that morning, not the clothes, but the history inside them. "You look like your father," Claudette said from the doorway. She was in her robe, holding her own coffee. "I take that as a compliment," I said. "It is one," she said. She kissed me once on the cheek and smoothed the lapel of my jacket. "Come home with your dignity intact." Which means don't raise your voice. "I never raise my voice," I said. "I know," she said. "That's why they never see you coming." Larry met me in the parking garage on 6th Street at 9:15. He was wearing his gray trial suit, which is what I call it because he only wears it when he is about to make a point. He had a leather portfolio under his arm and the particular expression he gets when he is completely prepared and slightly impatient to begin. We walked the 4 blocks to the branch together. The November air was sharp and clean. Uptown Charlotte was already moving. Office workers, the morning rush at the Starbucks on the corner, the sound of the light rail. Larry briefed me as we walked. In the weeks since the incident, he had gathered several pieces of information. The first was a review of my account history with that branch, which showed 41 transactions over the past 18 months, totaling over $3.2 million in movement through that single account, not counting the accounts held by Washington Commercial Holdings under subsidiary LLCs. The second was a conversation his regulatory colleague had facilitated, carefully, legally, through proper channels, that had revealed one prior formal complaint filed against that branch in the past. 14 months involving what the complainant had described as dismissive and demeaning treatment based on appearance. That complaint had been resolved, quietly with a written apology and a small account credit. The third piece of information was something Larry had learned only 2 days prior, and it was the one that changed the character of the meeting entirely. He told me as we crossed College Street. Marcus, full name Marcus Deshaun Powell, 24 years old, employed by Truist Bank at that branch for 11 months, had posted something on his private social media account the evening of the day I had been in the branch. The post had since been deleted, but a former colleague at the branch had seen it and, troubled by it, had taken a screenshot. The post contained a description of a customer interaction that was unmistakably mine. The wire transfer amount, the old suit, the request to see the manager, framed as an amusing story about a customer who thought he was somebody. It had received 14 likes before it was deleted. The screenshot was in Larry's portfolio. I stopped walking. We were on the corner of 5th and Tryon. He posted it publicly? I said. Private account, but not private enough, Larry said. The colleague who screenshotted it came forward voluntarily. She felt it was wrong. I stood there for a moment. The light changed. People moved around us on the sidewalk. Does Hargrove know? I asked. He knows everything in this portfolio, Larry said. I started walking again. Then let's not keep him waiting. We arrived at the branch at 9:28. Through the glass doors, I could see the lobby, the marble floor, the teller windows, the seating area near the entrance where I had sat for 11 minutes. Standing near the manager's office, speaking with a woman I didn't recognize, was Vincent P. Hargrove. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, the posture of someone who had spent 30 years in institutional finance. The kind of man who carries himself like the building belongs to him, because in a meaningful sense, it does. I noticed, as I pushed through the door, that Garrison Webb was standing off to the side near the back wall, near the desk where he had processed my transfer. He looked like a man who had not slept well in several days. I didn't dwell on that. I had not come here for him and Marcus. Third window from the left, exactly where he had been. He saw me the moment I walked in. I watched him recognize me. I watched the recognition travel across his face, the way weather moves across an open field. He went very still. Vincent Hargrove crossed the lobby to meet me. He extended his hand before he was halfway there. That was the moment, that movement, that urgency to reach me, that told me everything I needed to know about how seriously the institution had taken what Larry had laid out in the weeks prior. "Mr. Washington," he said, "thank you for coming in. I'm Vincent Hargrove. I know who you are," I said, shaking his hand. "We met at the Urban Land Institute conference in Raleigh in 2019. You gave the keynote on mixed-use development in secondary markets." He blinked. "You were there." "I was there," I said. "I found it informative." He held my hand a half-second longer than a standard handshake. Something passed through his expression, the fully assembled picture of who he was standing in front of, clicking into place in real time. "Please," he said, "come to my office. I won't give you every word of what was said in that room. Some of it was legal in nature, and Larry has advised me on what is appropriate to share. But I will tell you the substance of it, because the substance matters." Vincent Hargrove opened by apologizing. Not a corporate apology. Not "we're sorry if your experience fell short of our standards," the language of institutional non-admission. He apologized directly, using my name, acknowledging the specific events of that morning in detail, that made clear he had read Larry's account carefully and completely. Then he slid a document across the desk. It was a letter, drafted on Truist Bank letterhead, addressed to Washington Commercial Holdings, acknowledging that the treatment I had received on the morning in question fell below the institution's stated standards of conduct and represented a failure of professional judgment and cultural competency. It further acknowledged the existence of the prior complaint filed 14 months earlier and committed to a formal internal review of that branch's service protocols. It was signed by Hargrove and countersigned by a name I recognized from the bank's regional leadership that I will not mention here. I read it once. I handed it to Larry. He read it, made 2 notes in the margin, and looked at me. I looked at Hargrove. "I have a question," I said. "Not for the record. Just for my own understanding." "Of course," he said. "Mr. Powell deleted his post," I said. "But before he did, it received 14 interactions. In your assessment, how many of those 14 people are also employed by this institution?" The room was very quiet. "That question," Hargrove said carefully, "is part of what the internal review will address." "Good," I said. "Then I'll wait for the review to conclude before I decide what else, if anything, requires my attention." That was a sentence I had rehearsed. Larry had heard it. He didn't react, but I saw the smallest adjustment at the corner of his mouth, because Hargrove heard exactly what was between the words. He heard, "I am not done. I am watching. And I have resources, patience, and documentation." There is a moment in certain negotiations when the other party understands the full weight of what they are dealing with. Not because you've threatened anything, not because you've raised your voice or made demands, simply because the record speaks for itself and there is nothing left to hide behind. I watched that moment arrive for Vincent Hargrove. He sat up slightly straighter. He nodded once, with a deliberateness that wasn't agreement so much as acknowledgement. "Mr. Washington," he said, "I want to say, for what it's worth, that your business has been with this institution for over 30 years. That relationship is not something we take lightly. It is something we have clearly, on at least one occasion, failed to honor appropriately. I hope you will give us the opportunity to do better." I let that sit in the air for a moment. Then I said, "That will depend on what the review produces." We shook hands. Hargrove walked me out. And here is where I come back to the beginning. That walk across the lobby, the one I described at the start of this story, was not staged. I didn't choreograph it. What happened was simply what happened when a man who had done everything right, for the right reasons, in the right order, walked back into the room where he had been disrespected and let the room correct itself. Hargrove came through the glass doors of that office and crossed the marble floor with his hand already extended and his head already forward in that particular tilt that told anyone watching that this man mattered. I didn't announce myself. I didn't make a speech. I simply walked. I looked at Marcus once, just for a moment. He was standing at his window. He wasn't serving anyone. He was watching. And in the look I gave him, no anger, no satisfaction, no performance, I tried to communicate only one thing. I see you. And I hope you understand something today that it took me a long time to understand myself, which is that the way you treat people is the autobiography you write in real time. Every interaction is a chapter. Make sure you're telling the story you actually want your life to be about. I don't know if he received that message. People receive what they're ready to receive, but I meant it. Larry and I walked out onto North Tryon Street. The November sun had broken through the cloud cover, and it was warmer than it had been all week. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment. "How do you feel?" Larry asked. I thought about it honestly. "Tired," I said. "The good kind?" He laughed. He adjusted his portfolio under his arm. "I'll send you the follow-up documentation when the review concludes. Probably 4 to 6 weeks. I'll be here," I said. We shook hands. He walked south toward his office. I stood on the sidewalk for another minute, watching the city move. The review concluded 41 days later. The findings, as communicated to Larry in writing, were as follows. Marcus Deshawn. Powell had received a formal written reprimand and had been placed on a 60-day performance improvement plan. The colleague who had received the prior complaint, a situation that had occurred under Garrison Webb's predecessor, had also been identified and counseled. Garrison Webb himself had been enrolled in the bank's mandatory cultural competency and professional conduct training, along with 4 other branch employees. More significantly, Vincent Hargrove's office initiated a voluntary audit of complaint records at 7 Charlotte area branches, looking for patterns of differential service. That audit, I was told, had resulted in 2 additional cases being flagged for review and a broader policy update regarding documentation, requirements for large transactions at the teller window. I'm not going to tell you that fixed everything. I'm 67 years old. I know better than to expect institutions to fix everything. What I will tell you is that something shifted. Something moved. In a way that had the potential to reach people whose names I'll never know, whose accounts are smaller than mine, who don't have Larry Pittman's number saved in their phone. That is what I meant when I told Charles Everett Booker at that lunch at Aria on East 5th Street that I wasn't going to do nothing. Nothing is always a choice, and it is never a neutral one. Claudette and I had dinner at home the night the review concluded. She made her mother's baked chicken, cast iron skillet, herbs from the garden, lemon and garlic, the way you can only do it if you learned it from someone who learned it from someone. We ate at the dining room table, the good china, candles. Not because it was a celebration exactly, More because some moments deserve to be marked properly. Is it done? She asked. It's done, I said. She poured the wine. Sweet tea for me. I've never been much of a wine drinker, which Claudette has accepted in 41 years of marriage with admirable grace. She raised her glass. To your mother, she said. Who knew about the long game before anyone called it that? To my mother, I said. We drank. We ate. Outside, the Japanese maple in the back garden was bare for the winter, but it was still standing, still exactly where Claudette had planted it in 1999, rooted and patient and absolutely certain that spring was coming. That's the thing about patience. It doesn't eliminate the cold. It doesn't pretend the winter isn't real. It simply understands, with the certainty of everything that has come before, that the cold is not the final word. Marcus Powell laughed at my old suit on an October morning. He looked at what I was wearing and decided he knew what I was worth. And he was not the first person to make that mistake, and he will not be the last. But here is what I know at 67 years old. In this city where my grandfather built a house by hand and my father drove past the banks that wouldn't lend him money, the suit was my father's pattern and my grandfather's ambition and 40 years of work done with integrity and grace. He didn't see any of that. And that failure of vision was never my limitation. It was always his. Wear what you love. Do the work. Document everything. Choose patience over impulse every single time. And trust that the truth, when given enough room, will always fill it. I'm Theodore James Washington. I bank at Truist Bank on North Tryon Street in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I have been taken seriously in that building for a very long time. Thank you for being here with me today. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever walked into a room already having to prove something no one else in that room had to prove, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Drop a comment. Tell me your name. Tell me where you're from. Tell me if your grandmother also had something to say about patience. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.